Hi, thanks so much for having me. Really excited to see everything yesterday and listen to what everyone is thinking about. As was discussed, I'm really going to focus this morning on the sort of what we can learn from the history, particularly the last 20 years of the web, really since the birth of sort of personal blogging. And I want to draw a connection between the tools and the software we use and build and our sort of current situation, which is certainly saturating not just our conversations here about how platforms affect our work, but also how we move forward. Particularly, and I sort of move between America and England, and particularly over there, that there's a lot of technology press. Certainly, it's overcovered, but there is. Very often from the consumer's point of view, should I upgrade? Should I buy the latest phone? And then also maybe from the investor's point of view, how healthy is this company? How healthy is this stock? But very rarely is technology covered from a sort of humanistic point of view. How will this affect society? And then, particularly in the last, year and 18 months maybe, especially with the elections in France and America, there was some conversation, but the conversation addressed a very brief horizon, just really 2 or 3 years of media. But I think really we're living today with the ramifications of 20 years of media. So one of the writers who does a great job of writing from a sort of human point of view is a writer named Jenna Wortham at the New York Times, and she wrote a feature recently. There was sort of a revisiting of the sort of founding ethos, one of the founding ethoses of the internet, which was that information wants to be free. And she said that a governing ethos of the internet has been that whatever flows through it, information, ideas, is up for grabs. And she especially cited, some popular tweets, that were sort of begetting, movie contracts and work. But, 20 years in, I would say, information wants to be free is still true, but information wants to be free as long as there are platforms that can sort of make money on it. She cites an example of a sort of action movie on Twitter that would star Rihanna and Lupita Nyong'o. But obviously that movie is not going to be distributed for free. And Facebook and Twitter, and Google, as discussed yesterday, are platforms that are sort of engaging in the advertising ecosystem, often in a way that some publishers, if the discussion yesterday is any indication, feel perhaps at times sort of crowds them out. So a little bit about me, just very briefly. I founded the first blogging company in New York. It was a company called Apperceptive. We were actually powering pretty much all of the newspapers in the Northeast. Our software powered the Boston Globe, the Newark Star-Ledger, the New York Times. The Huffington Post was founded on our technology. The Washington Post used our technology. So I've been working with newspapers for a long time. That company was acquired by a company called 6apart, which managed, basically to host not just TypePad and Movable Type, but also LiveJournal, which I know is popular in this part of the world as well. And in 2011, I sort of moved out of the sort of ad-focused world of web and into paid content with a company called 29th Street Publishing. And the goal was really to make paid content and subscription-based apps and websites as easy as blogs were. And so I'm going to talk about what I learned through that process and hopefully help to chart a path forward. So I think it's really wonderful the way we use the web to build relationships and friendships. I met most of my best friends on the web. I met most of my coworkers on the web. I started both my companies very much on the web and got a lot of benefits, marketing benefits, and found customers on the web. And we take it for granted that the web works the way that it does, especially like where would we share photos if not for Instagram? Where would we share family photos if not, for Facebook? All these companies, there's sort of an engineering culture that powers these companies. And part of a healthy engineering culture is a notion of collective success and failure rather than, individual success and failure. And I think this is something that journalists and the media really need to learn from. And I don't mean collective within your own company, but I mean collectively sort of all of us who build tools and who work in media. As journalists, and tool builders, we benefit greatly from Facebook. And as consumers, we have much more access to news than we did in the past. But we've sort of allowed ourselves to be marginalized from the process of the production of those tools in a way that wasn't always true. This is these tweets. There was a very popular thread, I'm not sure if you all saw this week on the site Reddit. An engineer on the first day of job had dropped his company's production database. And so this company, Glitch, started a Twitter conversation about what are the biggest mistakes you've ever made in your job. And John Ressig gives this quote here. He says, "I managed to delete my entire production database minutes before the daily backup was made." He's the inventor of jQuery, which is software that's on many pages on the web, if not the majority of the pages on the web. It certainly popularized JavaScript. And Michael Pryor says, he crashed. He has a newspaper clipping from the time he brought down the Boston College's entire email system. He's the CEO of Trello, which is a company that a lot of us have tools that use in journalism. So the idea, this is sort of obviously celebrating failure, but more than not literally celebrating failure, but celebrating the ethos of making mistakes and learning from it. But to make a mistake and learn from it, you really have to examine those mistakes in a critical way. So I'm going to talk about the hook. This is the product hook. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this. This is from a book called Hooked by Nir Eyal. And if you're in Silicon Valley, certainly, you've seen this chart many times than is reasonable, perhaps. But I just want to talk about it here. Basically, the idea is that there's a trigger that brings someone into your product. There's an action, an easy call to action. Your product has a good user experience. There's a variable reward, which then creates a sort of investment on the user's behalf, and then they invite other people, and your system grows. Okay? So I'll just take, for example, a newspaper, a print newspaper you might find. The trigger would be that there's a headline, there's something someone wants to read, there's an important piece of news. The action is that obviously it's read. The reward is that then you feel enlightened, you feel smart, you can tell your friends about it. And then you have an investment in that paper because there's sort of an intellectual relationship with the title. And then you tell your friends. And that's how the sort of cycle of like a traditional news organization would work. It's sort of a long cycle. It's on a cycle of days or weeks or months, the time it takes people to discover media and share it. Now, in the Valley, a lot of people will sort of recognize the health of sort of a company or media by how short this cycle is. So, in the case of a newspaper or a magazine, we might be dealing with a cycle of months. But in the case of, like Facebook or Instagram, we're dealing with a cycle of sort of minutes or seconds. So, the trigger of Instagram, someone might share a photo that you want to look at. The action might be posting a photo, which creates an investment because your photo is there. Or the action might be that you favorite a photo, which is, you're sending a social signal to your friend that you appreciate what they're doing. And all these things create vested investments. And then, the trigger obviously is that you invite people to either see your photos or to see your friends' photos. So you can see these cycles, from a sort of Silicon Valley, sort of MBA-focused point of view. The cycles that software companies are dealing with is much tighter, is much more accelerated than what newspapers or magazines would traditionally deal with, even online. So when you start a company or you are launching a title and you want to sort of deal with the lingua franca of the technology age, I think that there's sort of different languages being spoken right now, and it's a bridge we have to breach. So what I would say is that one thing is that even though this seems perhaps mercenary, is journalists need to start to think this way. Journalists need to feel like they're developers and their careers are products, and that not just the media and their audience, but also to your fellow journalists and your, if you're a freelancer, the people you work for, if you're a staff writer at a newspaper, your fellow editors. So I want to go back. I don't know how many of you guys have used this or familiar with Flickr.com. It's an early photo sharing site, if not the first photo sharing site. At the time, if you had a blog and you wanted to post photos from your phone, you had to download special software, you would install special software, you probably had to upgrade your hosting account, and then you maybe also had to upgrade your phone. There's a huge barrier to entry if you wanted to share photos on the internet. Flickr started, and 2002 it launched, and I believe 2004 is when it sort of became a sort of much larger affair. And one of the major innovations that Flickr brought is sort of discoverability. It used to be that if you wanted to share a photo, you had to basically email the link to your friend. This is, obviously there were social networks, but not at any kind of scale. And so one of the innovations that Flickr had was these tags. They created tags. So you could sort of type in whatever you wanted. You're familiar with tags, probably. So you could associate whatever tags you wanted with the photo. So if suddenly it was discoverable, and you could say, I just want to see London, I just want to see England, I just want to see, anything you wanted. And with this came a sort of move from, individually hosted sites and individually owned, websites onto networks. So Flickr was really the first sort of great social network where people, especially like media makers, were enthusiastic about sort of leaving behind their own sites and going to a hosted site. And now, obviously, this is owned by Verizon in America. And it's, I think, absurd to assume that every journalist, or maybe even every paper would own their own photo sharing site. But I just want to point out that it was a very intentional decision to sort of give up the self-determination that came with sort of hosted software. At the same time when this happened, the business of sharing on the internet changed, and it's never changed back. It went from a situation where you would purchase software and you would purchase hosted space on a server to a situation where you would post your photos to someone else's server. So as a reader or a consumer of news or media, there was no change in the product except that it was at a different location. You took a photo and you saw it on your own website, that was wonderful, or if you took a photo and I saw it on Flickr, to me, the relationship with you is that you took a photo and that I enjoyed it. But when you look at it from a business perspective angle, suddenly advertisers join the equation rather than being a situation where you were paying for hosting and you had a direct relationship with your readers. Now there was a third party, which again, today is Verizon or Yahoo. But we also, this is the same for Facebook and Flickr, and Twitter rather. And obviously Google as well. So Flickr didn't quite invent tags, but they were the first to sort of deploy it at that large scale. And until then, this is an old version of movable type. Now, most people use other software for blogging, obviously. But movable type was the first blogging software to introduce tags at an editorial level. Before movable type, editors would write categories, and they would say, okay, I write about sports, and so the categories in my blog are like, football, baseball, basketball, and cricket. But now you could have tags, and you could just type and associate whatever tags you wanted with your content. And I think, obviously, this is like a fantastic experience, both for the journalist who's free to write about whatever they want, and from the reader who finds it easier to discover. But at the time, Google was still a sort of smaller search engine, didn't have the sort of central role in their life it did today. And the way they would parse the internet is they basically had software that would go and inspect every page, and their engineers would write algorithms that would change almost at one site at a time to better discover what the site was about and how it should be organized. And with the invention of tags, suddenly, and well-formatted content where there's sort of a title and a published date, this is more or less the exact same metadata today that you would have now, and it's this screen is 17 years old. Once Google could sort of organize sites like this, they could then sort of vacuum up most of the web, and also begin to look at ranking pages not just by how reputable the incoming links were, but also how well structured it was. So this is the birth of search engine optimization, right? So I'm not sure you guys are familiar with this the same way we are in America, but in sort of American journalism, there's this joke about like what time is the Super Bowl. Every year there's hundreds and thousands of what time is the Super Bowl posts that go up. And obviously there are not thousands of journalists that think that their audience needs access to this unique piece of data of what time is the Super Bowl, because most people know when and what day the Super Bowl is on. But there's so much web traffic that it's something that is like a staple of most every publication. And you can see up here the sort of tags associated. There's no sort of like journalistic value to this content. Predict the news, prediction, Super Bowl 2011, Super Bowl 2011 time. There's more or less like 60 variations on the exact same phrase. And you can see the same thing here. This is like a story about Kim Kardashian. And you could properly organize this article by just simply saying like Kardashian, Kim Kardashian. But there's like 60 tags. And this is also when someone types something in a search engine, they discover this page above others. So the connection I want to make here is that this was really when blogging went from something that allowed journalists self-determination. It was very cheap to publish. Now suddenly journalists were effectively working for Google. They were sort of organizing their content in such a way that it was more easily indexable and searchable for Google. They're not, you may think at first discoverability is a service we provide to our readers, but these are not extreme cases. So the other thing that was born at the same time is basically spam blogs. And this was 2003, 2004. Once you have these sort of like well-organized pages, all of a sudden, for every one blog that was like a real blog by a journalist or by a young person who felt passionately about music, there would be 99 spam blogs, and they would all be optimized to be sort of discovered by Google. And one of them might be like you would be able to look at Google's sort of search auctions and tell what are the more expensive ads selling. So someone who would know nothing about for instance the field of law would post all these keywords that had to do with like expensive litigation, so they could get basically AdSense revenue. So these were pages that were just filled with nothing but spam, but they were incredibly lucrative because Google was indexing them and indexing the tags associated with the pages, and then Google was also serving the advertisements on the pages. They were then making money that were purchased by people who were wanting to buy ads on those topics. So Google was fueling this ecosystem of spam, and frankly continues to. Basically on the backs of like a culture that was built by journalists and the idea of free information. And this was, today we might call this fake news. And so when we talk about fake news, this isn't something that was sort of like born, to elect Trump or born to bury Macron, in France. This is a sort of battle that's been fought between, publishers and those who would sort of exploit platforms, for nearly 2 decades. And then, another thing that's not come up at this conference as much, but Google also has a platform called Google AMP. And I meet with a lot of publishers in New York, and very often they're like, one of the things with Google AMP, so we had this sort of migration where people went from hosting their own content to working with platforms. And now Google AMP is this third migration where maybe you're not hosting your site, but with Google AMP, you're actually surrendering control over your URL. So like Facebook Instant Articles, the content is very clean. It's a beautiful experience for mobile users. But it also is not hosted or controlled by you. And then, as the point that was made yesterday about Facebook Instant Articles, the design is for the most part undifferentiated. And so when publishers move to Google AMP, they're really giving up control of their content, and they're also giving up the naming of their content. And I think it's a similar shift sort of away from self-determination. And it's something that should be thought about critically. I'm not necessarily against Google AMP, but we should understand what the trade-offs are. And I think one reason publishers are so excited about Google AMP is because SEO, even though it had a lot of negative side effects, was something that every publisher understood. I organize my site this way, I put ads on my articles, I put tags on my articles, and I start making money. This is great. And a lot of shifts, since then have been incredibly confusing, like the shift towards Twitter and Facebook. No one would have imagined that Twitter would become the place where journalists have to promote their links, and it's something they do for free on their own time. No one imagined that Facebook would own so much of the media ecosystem. So with AMP, even though Google is taking a much more aggressive stance towards your content to the extent where they own the URL, there's almost a nostalgia for the pre-platform days. And all of this also is happening at the same time where authority and reputation move from like a publication's masthead to a publication's followers count. And anything that can be seen as sort of generating value on these platforms can be sold. So this is a picture of a vending machine in Moscow where you can buy followers on these social networks. Perhaps more efficiently that you can buy ads on Facebook or Google. So I don't know exactly how the currency translates, but it's fairly cheap. It's 1p a follower on Instagram. I don't have a lot of Instagram followers. And then the other thing that happened at the same time as sort of followers became the currency of reputation in media is that Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter became ascendant. And the major change between a sort of platform and a publisher can be boiled down to like, when you're a publisher, when you're the New York Times, and someone goes to nytimes.com, more or less all of us could type that page in and we would see the exact same thing. And to me, that's the definition of a publisher. You're choosing, this is what I'm going to put on my page. Whereas when you're a platform, if we go to youtube.com or facebook.com, we would see something different. In fact, if we went back and then hit reload, we would all see something different multiple times each time we reloaded the page. And one thing, when everything was on sort of publishers' owned sites, owned or hosted sites, the publisher could control the message, they could control the attitude. But as soon as you're in a stream, you might be like the New York Times and write a story about the impact of terrorism on the French election or on the British election. And you would come back, you might be adjacent to a story that is basically a spam story or a fake story is completely concocted. And the way the design of those sites work, there's no differentiation between the two. So again, the pattern is, publishers sort of like bending a little bit the product they create towards using platforms and losing self-determination and in effect losing authority. So I want to sort of return to the hook a little bit. So even though otherwise beloved communities like Flickr had great comments, great responses to their photos, they still had to hire many community managers who would then often themselves become the targets of sort of nasty dialogue and nasty comments. Comments are wonderful when they're good, but the cost of keeping them has been and remains prohibitive. And there are a few companies working on this, notably Civil Comments in Portland, Oregon, and the Coral Project in New York. But it's still a very hard problem. And I want to we can't get into it. We could probably do several hours just on commenting and the sort of impact of comments on blogs and Facebook. But if you begin to think of your career as a journalist or as a tool builder as a product, and you have this same hook, both the variable reward and the investment are going to come from putting your community at the center of your product. And that means you're going to have some sort of commenting system. This is probably the single hardest, most unsolved problem on the internet. And this is what, the reason we can't just today surrender Facebook and Twitter and YouTube is because we value the feedback and the connection to our audience so much. Even though it's not as substantive as it once was, it still is something that's required. But it's very easy to see where followers fit into this if you're a publisher today. It's very easy to see where page views and revenue from Facebook fit into this in terms of your own cycle of gaining audience. And so it's kind of like eating, dessert instead of a meal. Microblog is a new network. It's launching out of Austin, Texas. And it's very much built to not necessarily be sort of an anti-Twitter or an anti-Facebook, but it's a platform that is built only for publishing and encourages publishers to own their own domains and has no following counts, actually does not even have like a retweet button. So I'm not necessarily a proponent of microblog. I have no relation with microblog, but it's the first product that I've seen in several years that is really sort of jettisoning all the sort of best practices, quote unquote, for other sort of like social products, and is really asking, journalists and writers to produce their content and create value on their own. So I think it's worth looking at, and it's also worth following the founder, Manton Reese. His website is manton.org. He writes a lot about this. So this was discussed yesterday, but just, when you're sort of thinking about products and thinking about building a product and building a business, just to beware of the obvious. A word of advice, especially in the sort of mainstream press in the West, is when someone says something that is entirely obvious, it's very rarely true. So in this case, in sports you see it all the time, like the manager has our complete confidence, or the player is definitely going to be on our team next year. Whenever you say something like that, you can be sure that the opposite is going to happen, right? And so, when there was the story about the Trump campaign, possibly working with other governments or possibly funding fake news to swing the election, Mark Zuckerberg's response, and this is from a Bloomberg story, was, I think there's a profound lack of empathy in asserting that only reason someone could have voted the way they did is they saw fake news. And obviously this is like a comment. He shouldn't have to make the comment that people know how to vote on their own. People know how to make good decisions. Not only does he know and understand the incredible volume that sort of spam blogs and fake news and the damage it creates to his site, but he knows how much people are being swayed and convinced by the media on Facebook. And in fact, that's what Facebook does. Facebook is an influence engine, and the very business of Facebook is built on people injecting ads into the stream of content where you have trusted journalists and your friends and family. And so it's incredibly disingenuous to say that this didn't have an impact on these elections. But I also think, getting back to the sort of spirit of collective failure, that we journalists and we tool builders have to realize that we are a part of it. Even if you're not creating fake news, if you're participating in a network, you're enabling fake news. Because if there was nothing but fake news on Facebook, no one would go to Facebook. Also from Bloomberg, this is the one story, Grigoris yesterday posted many people who had cited this story, but there was only one in Bloomberg that wrote the story about Trump's campaign use of Facebook before the election, and that was in Bloomberg. And at the time, it was an unprecedented amount of access into the Trump campaign. And basically, what they said, and this is Brad Pascal, who's the chief digital officer for Trump. There was an interview with Mr. Pascal and Steve Bannon, who's sort of a very reactionary figure in America. You might call him an oligarch if he was Armenian. He basically said, they're on the record, and this is still up on the site. They basically said, we know that we're going to lose, but we have found through advertising for Trump that we have this unbelievably loyal base. And we think that we can basically activate this base to make an independent media company once Trump loses the election. And this is someone from a sort of, it's hard to read the quote here, but it's this is a sort of rival Republican's aide, said, Trump will get 40% of the vote, and half that number at least will believe the claim that the election was rigged or stolen from him. That is more than enough people to support a multi-billion-dollar media business and a powerful presence in American politics. So we can put aside the outcome of the election, which obviously we're all living with now. But I just want to make the point that the plan for Facebook was not to get elected. It was to create and take advantage of an engine for political rage. And it was far more successful than even they planned to do. And I just, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but this is something, if you go back to sort of the blogging engines that were so liberating and so fantastic for early journalists and helped with distribution and helped newspapers survive the transition to the web, things like tags and sort of structured data and SEO gave rise to spam blogs. And you can really draw a straight line from these tools that I was a part of building and many other people were a part of building into the sort of environment where we are today. And that's just something that, again, I think we have to find a way to take collective responsibility for. Talking Points Memo is a site that I worked on in 2000s, the Washington Post I worked on. And they're both very lefty, very political sites that today are part of the resistance. But the way Facebook was used was that people would target minority voters, undereducated voters using Facebook. And so next to this sort of like radical pro-left American news would be disinformation, which would, with the aim for discouraging people to vote. So again, even media that is mostly independent, and mostly sort of on the right side of history, as I would say it, becomes part and parcel of this problem. And I want to stress as well, the Trump campaign did nothing illegal. In fact, while the left in America was gloating about the sort of incompetence of the campaign and the assuredness of Hillary Clinton's victory, the Trump campaign was really like inventing an incredibly efficient and wicked way to use Facebook to get, to their ends. And this, again, is something that I think we all hold some responsibility for. So another thing, I want to sort of move into like more concrete advice, both, especially for startups and startup journalists. I just have to talk about Facebook sometimes. Part of, what Facebook does and what, all technology companies do is we go back to that hook diagram. And when you meet with like a venture capitalist or you meet with like a partner technology company, they all want that hook diagram to be as tight and as short as possible. And the idea is that no one really knows the idea that's going to win. It's very hard to project success and know the way things are going to end up. Everyone's idea, you can be the smartest person with the best idea in the world, and your idea is probably wrong. But if you create a system where you can learn what works and what doesn't as fast as possible, you can improve it. And that's the sort of algorithm that runs sites like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. And this is why when you talk to some people in technology, they talk about failing fast. They don't mean like going out of business. They mean like learning what's happening and how do you learn from failure to improve. So we, journalists, can apply these rules to our interactions with platforms. So one thing is like learn about networks, each network's strengths and weaknesses. I would say with Facebook, the strength is a fantastic access to audience, rich internationalization, fantastic performance on mobile. The weakness is that you can be, at times, sort of part and parcel with a much larger political movements that maybe you aren't accustomed to. You can't control who you sit next to in the cafeteria, so to speak. You need to ensure that you own your content and host your own sites. There's a lot of people now who are talking about like launching sites only on Facebook News or only on Google AMP. I want to stress that beyond the fact that you're at risk of them simply disappearing, you're also losing control over your business entirely. So just the one thing that all journalists must do is own their own content and their own site. Even if you work for a paper, consider that paper a platform that you publish into. Even if you have a great relationship with them, make sure that you have your own site with your own content on it. Think small. No one solves a big problem. Everyone solves a big problem by turning it into many small problems and breaking them down. And then if you have a big product cycle and you're halfway through and you run out of money, that's a failure, even if you had the right idea. So 29th Street Publishing, the company that I founded and ran for 5 years, was an app company. And one of the things about apps compared to the web is that they're very expensive. And so you might be like, a lot of very large publishers wanted to go all in on apps, and they found themselves spending tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars on apps, but then the platform would change because they didn't have control over it. So halfway through the cycle of development, they find out that they're out of money. And even though these are like beautiful products with loyal audiences and readers, they're considered a failure because they don't exist anymore. It's just sort of particularly about 29th Street Publishing. Small successes are failures too. Very early in our cycle, we had like fantastic success. I was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. I was on the front page of like the city section of the New York Times. I was interviewed on Bloomberg TV. It was like all these journalists, and the angle of 29th Street Publishing was that if you didn't want to participate in this sort of like ecosystem of ads that was bad for publishers and bad for the world at this point, you have to own your audience. You have to sell subscriptions to your audience and make money back. And publishers loved it. And so we got all sorts of like inbound media. There was a few months where it was like I couldn't stop, talking with people and getting published. But we thought that was winning. But in fact, the products weren't growing as fast as they had to. And so we had this sort of like small success. We didn't realize that it wasn't enough of a success, and it became a failure. Only work with people who are also excited about your product and pay yourselves. I got a Facebook message from this woman who runs a publishing house in the Midwest, very popular, tens of thousands of books sold. This weekend, she wrote herself a check for 3 years of expenses, and she still has not paid herself. And people who like are fans of this press would be shocked, and they'd feel like, How is this possible? Because you've sold so many books. They don't understand. People don't understand the cost of publishing, the cost of hosting, especially if you're dealing with printed books. So just, if you can't pay yourselves, if you can't work with people who are excited about what you do, you need to adjust. And so don't lionize the process of failing, but do practice sort of iterative changes to your products. It can be as simple as like a small change to your blog, or it can be as grand as something like launching an app. And also, there's just I got a few questions about this in the hallway. I wanted to talk about it. Yesterday, we started off with this conversation about sort of advertising your subscription. So these aren't real numbers from any publication, but I've worked with many hundreds of publishers, large and small, over the past decade, the biggest and the smallest. And so I think I can stand by these numbers as being real numbers. And I want to stress that this is in dollars. Obviously, I think the economics might be a little different in Armenia and in Russia and Eastern Europe, but probably the numbers are even lower. So the point will be made. If you're publishing in Facebook Instant Articles, you are likely to have many more readers than you will on your own site, but also a much lower CPM. CPM is a revenue, it's cost per 1,000 ad impressions. It's sort of the basic exchange rate of advertising on the internet. So if you have 500,000 readers who each look at 3 ads when they read an article, you're making $750. If you have 5 million readers, your effective CPM goes down because they're less valuable advertising, and you're making $4,500. These might be like monthly numbers. Obviously, the time is not material to the math, but let's assume these are monthly numbers. So 5 million readers to your blog on, that you're publishing through Facebook, you feel maybe fantastic, but that's $4,500 before cost. And on your own site, you might do better with half as many readers. There is a funny thing where when you're a sort of mid-sized website, it's actually harder to get ads, and so the price goes down. It's very easy to get your first 50,000, ads, and very easy once you're larger, once you have millions of ads. But even then, if you have, you're paying for a website that can have 2.5 million people, you're really only making $15,000 a month. So again, that's not a lot of money. Maybe it's enough for one editor and the costs associated with publishing. And of course, you have to pay your writers as well. So this was sort of what inspired me to move to subscription networks, both the importance of people owning their audience and also owning the relationship with the reader, but also owning the terms of the business. So Facebook, they've not announced it yet, but they will shortly, that they are also going to start selling subscriptions through Instant Articles. Google AMP today supports a paywall, as does Apple News. People don't use those as much. But I wrote Facebook here because Facebook is certainly the ascendant publishing platform, but you can imagine this is any platform. The first thing is you have to charge less, because if you're asking for more than $9.99 in the App Store or on Apple News, you probably will not have a lot of traction. And the second thing is you have a much lower subscriber conversion than you do on your owned and operated sites, just because you have a greater relationship. The person who visits you on your website has much more affinity for you than if they find you on Facebook. So if you have 5 million readers on Facebook, then I would estimate your subscription revenue will be just over $6,000. And if you have 2.5 million readers on your own site, you can charge them more, but you still are probably only getting a conversion rate of about 1%, which is $41,000, which is beginning to be a real business. But again, this is the success story. That's basically, of all the sort of scenarios I've laid out, that's the absolute best case. And so yesterday when I said the question was subscribers, subscriptions or advertising, and I said no, a lot of people were upset with me. But there does have to be a third way, and we have to figure out what it is. And I think that if we continue to put our work and our hands and our means of distribution in the hands of platforms, this is a scenario that is going to get worse for publishers and worse for writers. So it's really important that people begin to own their own products and build their own means of distribution. So hopefully things can get better and we can have a sustainable industry. Thanks very much.